Okay, so quick question. Has anyone else noticed that American daytime talk shows have somehow become the unofficial United Nations of British royal commentary? Like at some point, 5 women sitting behind a desk in New York became the go-to panel for dissecting the emotional health of a family that lives across an entire ocean, communicates almost exclusively through lawyers and press statements, and apparently hasn't figured out how to use the phone. And yet here we are, because Whoopi Goldberg, Sunny Hostin, Alyssa Farah Griffin, Anna Navarro and Sara Haines just spent a chunk of The View doing exactly that. Unpacking Prince Harry's emotional BBC interview, the ongoing RAVEC security battle, his relationship with King Charles, Prince William's very loud silence, and whether reconciliation is even still on the table. Which, frankly, is a lot of ground to cover for a show that also, on any given day, might pivot straight into a segment about air fryers.
In a new interview with the BBC, Prince Harry opened up about the legal security challenges that are preventing him from reconciling with his estranged dad, King Charles. So is making that on-camera plea gonna help chances? You think, don't think he's making it into a public spectacle? What are your thoughts?
I was conflicted over this because, so I think all of us agree you always want reconciliation. We had Jeremy Renner here last week, who basically, I mean, he had a near death. He actually says he died briefly in this snowmobile accident. And he said at the end, all that you remember is the people you loved. Not money, not titles, not crown jewels. So I think everyone roots for there to be reconciliation. Watching this, I kind of felt like it was a Hail Mary. Like he's probably made outreach, not heard back. I can't speak to why he hasn't heard back or whatever, but I think that he must have thought, if I go out there on the BBC, perhaps that's a way to signal to my father, you know, in this period that you have left, I do want to talk and reopen those lines of communication. And I root for it. I think that he acted in the interest of his family in the immediate, not thinking he was giving up the rest of his family for the rest of his life.
Yeah, you know, this issue came out of a legal case because in 2020, he was denied security protection. The type of security protection someone born into the royal family requires, because we know what that kind of thing is. There's a lot of exposure, not only for him, but for the Duchess, Meghan, his wife, and his 2 children. And he wants to go and show them his home country. And so that was stripped away from him because he decided that he didn't want the official duties. And a point that he made during that interview, which I thought was striking, is that there are people that serve their country, but then leave public service, but always have that protection for the rest of their lives because they're different. This is a man who was born into a family, born into that duty, spent tours in Afghanistan and served his country for 35 years. I think that does warrant the security. That being said, another thing that he said was, while he wants reconciliation, he learned from Canada that there cannot be reconciliation without truth. It's truth and reconciliation. So yes, he wrote the book. Yes, he told his side of the story. We haven't heard from the other side, but I don't think he should be punished for telling his truth, because I do really believe there is no reconciliation without that.
Okay, so this struck me pretty hard. You all, 3 of you have met my father. You know how incredibly close I have been with him
cute.
My entire life. It's been, you know, he's my touchstone. I've had him on a pedestal my entire life. And I think there's a lot of families. I'm going through this. I think there's a lot of families that might not be princes, may not be kings, that are going through very painful family estrangement, where there's these 2 sides that are at an impasse. And it is very, very hard, because sometimes there's so many layers of things that have happened, of history, of lies, of pain, of hurt to get over. My father's 85 years old. And so when you have that tick-tock in your head, right, telling you, reminding you, his father has cancer, mine is 85 years old. We can all go at any moment. But when you're talking about an 85-year-old or somebody with serious cancer, you know that's even more present in your mind. It is very damn hard. And I think it takes a lot of processing and a lot of humility it also takes both sides. I don't think it's something that can be done unilaterally. So as somebody that's going through it and hopes to be able to work it out, I really hope that they get the chance to reconcile, because my biggest fear is not reconciling with my father and then having regrets my entire life. And so I'm sure that's something that he's wrestling with as well, and so many in America. But girl, it's gonna take some liquor and some intercession from Pope Francis now that he's up there.
Well, reconciliation takes two people, but forgiveness takes one. And I think for some of the closure he's seeking, he's not promised a reconciliation. None of us are. But I look at how he broke so much with the royal family because, as Sonny, you alluded to, it was important for he and Meghan to have say in what people knew about their story, which was important. But I do think now, looking at it from a royal family, which is not relatable for me, but you don't break with, as Meghan called it, the firm. And they came out and they did a sit down with Oprah. They did a book. They did a documentary. I think the levels in which a royal family who's all about pent up tight secrets, which I'm not saying is the right way to do it, but I think he hit, there were going to be consequences. And I think sadly, this might be one of them. And my heart breaks because we also don't know how much contact he has. The king's health is probably high security knowledge that not everyone gets because that's a risk for them. And now you're talking to the son who did the sit down, who did the book, who did the documentary. So as much as he means well, and you can see as his throat tightens and he feels so many things, I believe him. I don't know if we're ever guaranteed that closure or reconciliation, and that makes my heart heavy.
And it's also sad that his mother, right, Diana, Princess Diana, worked so hard in the relationship of those two brothers. So in all likelihood, I suspect they are estranged as well. And I can tell you, I miss my father, and I'm sure he misses me. But it is just very difficult to take that first step, and I think it takes a lot of processing. This is something you and I have spoken about a lot, because you're on the other side of it, having lost your mother, having lost your brother, and knowing that sometimes you don't get a second chance.
Yeah, and sorry, real quickly, we see how quickly people can pass. We had a friend here at the show who lost their father suddenly and surprising. And as hard as it is to take the first step or say the first word, to have that chance ripped from you probably hurts more.
Well, you have to remember, this is what he wants. This is what he needs. And that's what he's putting out there. I don't know what Charles needs. I don't know what Charles wants to do. Maybe Charles feels he said everything he needs to say. And if that is the case, he's going to have to deal with it. It's, you can't decide for somebody else what they're going to do. You can only be accountable for your own actions. So, I always say whatever you need to say while people are breathing and walking around and are mad at you today. Say what you need to say. Because, that's when you need to tell people that you love them, when they're really pissed at you. Because that's when stuff happens and you're not ready for it. So you always have to, you can't leave these things unsaid. When you leave stuff unsaid and people disappear, there's nothing you can do, it's done. Don't leave it unsaid, y'all. We'll be right back.
So, tonight on Royal Truth Desk, we're taking this apart properly. What Harry actually said, what the panel actually debated, and why this entire saga somehow keeps circling back to the same 5 or 6 unresolved questions, no matter how many interviews, panels, or documentaries get thrown at it. Stick around, because we've got a lot to cover and a genuine professional opinion on whether Charles should pick up the phone. Spoiler, yes, obviously, but let's earn that answer properly. And if you enjoy royal commentary that takes the emotional stuff seriously without losing its sense of humour entirely, go ahead and subscribe now, because that's the exact tightrope we're about to walk. Let's start with the interview itself, because that's really the spark that set this whole conversation back on fire. Harry's recent BBC interview touched on a lot of emotionally heavy ground. His ongoing legal fight over his RAVEC security arrangements, his concerns about his father's health, and what sounded like a fairly direct, if slightly weary, plea for reconciliation with the family. And look, by now, we've all sort of become numb to the phrase "Harry gave another emotional interview," because it happens with a frequency that would make most royal historians dizzy. But even accounting for interview fatigue, there was something in this one that clearly struck a chord, because it wasn't just tabloids picking it apart. It made its way onto American daytime television, which tends to happen only when a story crosses over from royal gossip into something that reads as genuinely human, regardless of the crown involved. So let's talk about RAVEC first, because it's honestly the least emotionally messy part of this whole saga, even though it somehow keeps getting tangled up with everything else. RAVEC, the Executive Committee for the Protection of Royalty and Public Figures, is the body responsible for determining who gets government-funded security in the UK and under what circumstances. When Harry and Meghan step back from royal duties, their automatic entitlement to that level of taxpayer-funded protection changed, and Harry has been fighting that decision through the courts ever since, arguing that the risk assessment process wasn't handled fairly and that his family's safety is being treated as a bureaucratic technicality rather than a genuine security concern. Now, on the surface, this sounds like a fairly dry, procedural, legal dispute. The kind of thing that should, in theory, be entirely separate from questions of family relationships and reconciliation. But in practice, it's become almost impossible to untangle it from the emotional side of the story, because Harry has been fairly explicit that part of what stings about the whole situation is the sense that his own family's institution played a role in a decision that directly affects his children's safety. Whether or not you agree with how the legal process has unfolded, it's not hard to see why that particular grievance would bleed into every other conversation about reconciliation, rather than staying neatly contained in a courtroom. Then there's the part of the interview that seems to have hit hardest emotionally: Harry's concerns about his father's health. King Charles's cancer diagnosis has understandably reshaped a lot of the public conversation around the royal family over the past couple of years, adding a genuine sense of urgency to questions that might otherwise have simmered indefinitely without any real deadline attached. And that urgency is exactly what seemed to come through in Harry's comments. Less, "Here's my grievance," more, "Time might actually be limited here, and that changes things." Which, fair enough, nothing quite motivates a person to reconsider a long-standing family rift, like the reminder that time isn't infinite for anybody, royal or otherwise. So enter The View, stage left, ready to unpack all of this with their signature blend of genuine empathy and mild, simultaneous shouting. Whoopi Goldberg, from what's been reported, leaned into the human angle pretty hard, essentially making the case that whatever the politics or legal complexities, this is fundamentally a story about a son wanting to reconcile with his father while there's still time to do it. And that framing tends to cut through a lot of the noise pretty effectively. It's hard to argue with that read, honestly. Strip away the security detail contracts and the palace statements, and you've got a fairly universal, relatable situation. An estranged parent-child relationship, complicated further by illness, with a ticking clock that nobody asked for. Sonny Hostin, who's historically been fairly sympathetic to Meghan and Harry's side of this ongoing saga, reportedly pushed the conversation further into questioning why reconciliation has been this difficult to achieve, especially given the stakes involved. And that's a genuinely fair question to sit with. Because when you actually list out what's supposedly standing in the way of a phone call or a private conversation between a father and son, none of it holds up particularly well under scrutiny. Pride, protocol, unresolved hurt feelings, competing PR considerations. These are all real human obstacles, sure, but they're also exactly the kind of obstacles that tend to look remarkably small in hindsight once time actually does run out. Nobody on their deathbed has ever said, "Thank goodness we kept that family feud going a little longer." Alyssa Farah Griffin, bringing what's generally her more institutionally minded right-leaning perspective to these discussions, reportedly offered a bit more nuance on the security dispute specifically, acknowledging Harry's frustration while also noting the genuine complexity of security allocation decisions, which, to be fair, isn't an unreasonable point. Security arrangements for former working royals genuinely are complicated, involving real cost, real risk assessment, and real precedent-setting concerns that extend beyond any one family's personal circumstances. It's possible to sympathise with Harry's underlying concern for his family's safety while also acknowledging that the institutional side of this dispute isn't purely petty obstruction. Sometimes bureaucracies really are just slow and complicated, without necessarily being personally vindictive. Navarro, never one to hold back much, reportedly took a more pointed stance on the family dynamics themselves, essentially questioning why an entire family, headed by a father who is, by all accounts, dealing with a serious health situation, would let pride or protocol stand between them and a reconciliation that both sides have, at various points, expressed some level of desire for. Which, look, it's an easy sentiment to agree with in the abstract. Nobody's out here actively rooting for a father and son to stay estranged during a health crisis. But it's also worth acknowledging that just talk it out is a lot easier to say from a talk show desk than it is to actually execute when there's years of accumulated hurt, competing public narratives, legal proceedings, and an entire monarchy's worth of institutional baggage sitting in the way. And Sara Haines, generally the panel's more measured let's see both sides voice, reportedly tried to keep some balance in the conversation, acknowledging that reconciliation, if it happens, probably needs to happen privately rather than through further interviews and public statements, which honestly might be the single most reasonable point raised in the entire segment. Because here's the slightly uncomfortable irony sitting underneath this entire story. Every time reconciliation gets discussed, it gets discussed publicly through interviews, panels, and press coverage, which is sort of the opposite environment you'd actually want for two people trying to repair a genuinely personal relationship. It's very hard to have a private, vulnerable conversation about hurt feelings when the entire world is simultaneously live tweeting your family dynamics. Now, let's talk about the person notably absent from basically all of this discourse, Prince William, whose silence on the entire situation has become almost its own separate storyline at this point. William hasn't publicly addressed Harry's recent comments, hasn't weighed in on the RAVEC dispute, hasn't offered any public reflection on their relationship at all, which, depending on how you read it, is either a mature, deliberate choice to stay out of a public back and forth, or a fairly telling signal about where things currently stand between the brothers. Royal watchers tend to split pretty evenly on this interpretation. Some read William's silence as measured restraint, the appropriate response for a future king who shouldn't be litigating family disputes in public. Others read it as its own kind of statement, arguing that silence, maintained this consistently over this long a period, eventually starts to communicate something regardless of intent. And then there's Diana's legacy, which, inevitably, as it seems to with basically every Harry-related story at this point, gets pulled into the conversation because it's genuinely hard to talk about estrangement, grief, and reconciliation within this family without her name coming up eventually. Diana was famously someone who prioritized emotional openness in a way the monarchy historically hasn't always embraced. And there's a recurring thread in a lot of commentary suggesting that Harry's willingness to speak publicly about his feelings, his hurt, and his desire for reconciliation is, in some sense, an extension of that same instinct his mother modelled decades earlier. Whether that's a fair read or an oversimplified one is genuinely debatable, but it's a comparison that keeps resurfacing for a reason. Meghan's security situation also got a mention in the broader discussion, largely because it's structurally tied to the same RAVEC dispute affecting Harry and their children. It's worth remembering that this isn't purely an abstract legal matter. Real, documented threats have been part of the public conversation around Meghan specifically for years now, which is exactly why Harry has framed this security fight in such personal, high-stakes terms, rather than treating it as a bureaucratic inconvenience. Whatever your opinion of how the legal process has unfolded, the underlying concern about safety isn't a manufactured talking point. It's been a persistent thread since well before any of this became a legal battle. So, where does all of this actually leave the central question? Should Charles respond to Harry? And look, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, probably yes, though obviously the specifics of how and when are more complicated than a talk show panel or a YouTube commentary channel can fully resolve. Time genuinely is a factor here in a way it wasn't a few years ago, given Charles's health situation. And there's something to be said for the idea that public statements, legal disputes, and institutional protocol are all, frankly, much less important in the long run than whether a father and son actually get to have an honest conversation while they still have the chance to. That's not a particularly controversial opinion. It's basically universal human wisdom applied to an unusually famous family. That said, it's also worth pushing back gently on the assumption that reconciliation is purely Charles's responsibility to initiate, or that a single response would neatly resolve years of accumulated tension, legal disputes, and competing public narratives. Relationships this fractured rarely get fixed by one phone call or one gesture, no matter how well-intentioned. It's entirely possible that some kind of communication is already happening privately, away from cameras and panels and press statements, in a way that simply doesn't make it into public discourse. Which, if you think about it, would actually be the healthiest possible version of this story, precisely because we wouldn't be talking about it on channels like this one. So, did The View solve the royal family's rift tonight? Obviously not, though I'd argue they gave it a more thoughtful human treatment than a lot of royal-specific commentary manages, mostly because none of them have any particular loyalty to either side of this very British drama. They're just watching it the way most of us are, as an oddly relatable story about a complicated family that happens to also own several castles. If there's one thing everyone across that panel seemed to agree on, underneath all the individual takes, it's that reconciliation would probably be a good thing, and that time is a factor nobody involved can fully control, crown or no crown. So, did we solve anything tonight? Not really. Mostly we just confirmed that even a family with unlimited resources, several actual palaces, and presumably very good phone plans still struggles with the exact same communication issues as every other slightly dysfunctional family on the planet, which is somehow both deeply relatable and extremely funny when you sit with it for more than 5 seconds. If you enjoyed us taking the emotional stuff seriously while also acknowledging the sheer absurdity of 5 American talk show hosts becoming unofficial royal family therapists, that's basically our entire brand here at Royal Truth Desk. So go ahead, like this video, subscribe, and turn on those notifications, because we've got plenty more of these breakdowns coming. Let us know in the comments. Do you think Charles should reach out? Or do you think the ball's actually in Harry's court at this point? And more importantly, do you think we've officially entered an era where American daytime TV is the primary venue for royal family therapy sessions? Because from where we're sitting, the evidence is piling up. See you in the next one.